Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to do what is my second review of the Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro debate. It's my second review, and it's not. I'm a little curious. I can't really say I'm a little curious because it's myself. I can't specifically say that I found the debate or the discussion particularly interesting. That sounds really bad. It was interesting. The topic, I think, is inherently interesting. I guess compelling would be more so the right word. I didn't really necessarily find the discussion that compelling, but there are several points of the discussion that I wanted to focus on. And I guess I'm just rambling on about why I'm justifying to you that I'm doing a second video on this debate. My first video on the debate, I'll link in the description of this video if you would like to go back and watch it. In that first video, I focused on the first section of the debate. Now, the topic of the debate is whether or not religion is good for society, but in the first 20 to 30 minutes or so, the discussion is really about non-naturalistic processes that Shapiro believes point to a more theistic or support a more theistic worldview. The biggest example of that is, of course, free will is what they mostly focused on. And in that video, I kind of critique some of the judgments that Shapiro made about free will, specifically his argument that free will is a non-naturalistic process. But if you want to go watch that video, I would encourage you to do so. Also, shout out to the people who I'm having a conversation with in the comments section. JJCC78, who left a comment, as well as WITEC83. I'm not sure if either of those are names that you're supposed to pronounce, but thank you for everybody who commented there. I actually really enjoy responding to comments. I enjoy those conversations, especially when people are polite, even if they disagree with me. I like having those conversations. So thank you to the both of you. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the dialogue that happens in the kind of middle part of the debate, where they actually kind of get into the topic of whether or not religion is good for society. And O'Connor is going to give Shapiro a little bit of pushback. And again, what I'm focused on here is not so much the validity of the arguments that are presented, but rather the sort of narratives that are given, specifically the narratives that are given about history. And of course, my background is in the history and philosophy of science. So I want to pay attention to the claims of both Shapiro and O'Connor with respect to how they utilize that history. And a big question that I'm going to be focused on here is this question of meta narratives or narratives. Now, if you refer to my historical methodology lecture that I filmed, like it was one of the, I think the first video I uploaded on YouTube, but it was for my history class. A hallmark of historical methodology is the use of narrative. So history as a discipline occupies this rather unique space. I would say it's kind of a space between, for lack of a better word, more concrete disciplines that are specifically rooted in mathematics, the natural sciences, for example, and other disciplines where creativity plays a major role, such as the arts or literature. And I say that history occupies that unique space because, on the one hand, we have things like historical facts. Historical facts are pretty straightforward. Napoleon was crowned Emperor of France in 1809. That's a historical fact. But history's unique in that narrative plays a major role in how we explain those facts. What do those facts mean? Because these facts, in and of themselves, don't really tell us a lot about history per se. They don't answer the why is this fact important question that many of us are looking for. It's because of this use of narrative is one of the things that makes history complicated and difficult, especially for non-historians to kind of wrap their heads around, because we sometimes think of history as just the facts. Or conversely, some people think of history as just a story. History is the story told by the victors, that it's all a matter of perspective and all a matter of narrative. But in the 20th century specifically, there was a critique of what we call meta narrative. Now, meta narrative is a story about a story, so to speak. Meta narratives within the context of history are these big overarching stories that we tell about the past. And meta narratives specifically are dangerous because meta narratives can give us the wrong impression and lead us to believe the wrong things, not just about the past, but meta narratives also oftentimes serve typically for political reasons to justify our present situation. So, examples of meta narratives are all over the place. Now, most of the people that are listening to this are undoubtedly, according to what YouTube tracks, most of you are from the United States. So, meta narratives in this respect, you could think of stories that you're taught in school about United States history, right? These stories almost always portray the United States in a positive light. It's meant to inspire you, it's meant to encourage you to have faith in and to believe in the nation that you're a part of. And for other nations, it's no different, right? So, meta narratives in the United States, probably the biggest example would be the idea of manifest destiny, the United States conquest of the West and the claiming of the West for the United States. This is presented in a triumphalist sort of position that the building of the railroad and the expansion of people from one coast to the other is painted generally, especially if you remember from like being taught this in elementary school, as a triumph of the American people. Of course, it's a triumph of the American people over and against the peoples whose land they stole and the labor that they exploited in order to get there in the first place. So you can already see some of the issues here related to the use of and the practice of meta narratives. Now, what we're going to have here, I don't know if I would necessarily call this a meta narrative, but it is a sort of grand narrative. There's two kind of competing narratives at play. And my big critique here of both O'Connor and Shapiro is that there's an inherent problem with these meta narratives. That problem being that they oversimplify history and as a result are fundamentally inaccurate. And what I mean by inaccurate is that they don't paint a full picture. They're often utilized almost always for the sake of convenience, or in the case of Shapiro specifically, what I want to point out, it's utilized in order to further a political purpose. In the case of Shapiro, it's going to be a sense of Western superiority, Eurocentric focus on history that's going to come in the form of Judeo-Christian values is the code word that's often tossed around by Shapiro and others who also support this ideology. So I have a quote here from Jean Lyotard in his work, The Postmodern Condition. Lyotard will argue that meta-narratives or grand narratives are overarching and sort of totalizing in their language, totalizing explanations are stories that seek to provide a comprehensive account of history, knowledge, and ultimately of reality. Lyotard offers kind of two general critiques of these meta narratives as a whole to read the quote. First, the popular stories themselves recount what could be called positive or negative apprenticeships. In other words, the success or failures greeting the hero's undertaking. These success or failures either bestow legitimacy upon social institutions or represent positive or negative models of integration into established institutions. So these narratives oftentimes function in order to serve institutions or institutionalized goals, political agendas. And we'll come back to this in a second, what exactly the meta-narrative used by O'Connor and Shapiro or what institutions they're supposed to support. And second, the narrative form, unlike the developed forms of discourse of knowledge, lends itself to a great variety of language games. So the real problem here with these sorts of narratives, and the reason why I'm bringing this up in the first place, is that these narratives often function to legitimize certain forms of power, whether we're talking about political power, religious power, or institutional power of one way, shape, or form. And by contrast, they'll marginalize other groups. That is, they usually serve overtly political purposes. Okay, so what is all this jargon about meta narrative? Why am I bringing this up with the context of this debate? So we have a sort of meta narrative that occurs with throughout the 20th century historiography, specifically with respect to the history of science, and we get kind of these two competing narratives. On the one hand, we have what is called the conflict thesis, which got really popularized in the late 19th century, early 20th century by two gentlemen known as Draper and White, who wrote an account of the history of science. Now, the conflict thesis has been thoroughly rejected by historians of science over the past 50 years, largely because it oversimplifies the relationship between science and religion. The conflict thesis stating that science and religion are inherently at odds with each other. On the other hand, so the conflict thesis is on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is the opposite meta narrative, which is the claim that, typically speaking, is the claim that Christianity specifically, or Judeo Christian values, as it's often used. So we're excluding one of the other big three monotheistic religions, which we'll come back to here in a second. But the other claim is that Judaism and Christianity specifically led to these sort of hallmark institutions of the West, specifically that Christianity played a very special role or unique role in the development of science. Now, both of these are meta narratives, and both of these are oversimplifications because they're true and not true at the same time, right? In the past, there has been conflict between science and religion for sure, but the overarching relationship is not one defined by conflict, in the sense that I can show you plenty of examples of not conflict, but harmony. I can show you examples where religion actually promotes the scientific enterprise. Conversely, on the other hand, the idea that Christianity and Christianity alone gave rise to the sciences is also an oversimplification. It's true in the sense that, yes, Christianity played a role, perhaps even a major role, in the development of science, but it wasn't the only influence on the development of science. And in fact, it wasn't the only religious influence on the development of science. Now, both of these narratives, like I said before, meta narratives oftentimes serve a political goal. Both of these narratives have a overarching either political or philosophical thesis that they're trying to support. For the conflict thesis, it's that religion and science are fundamentally at odds with one another, and that we ought to believe science over and against religion because religion's always trying to hold science back, right? On the other end, the complementary thesis, the agenda that's being pushed typically is some form of Christian exceptionalism, that Christianity has some sort of unique role or unique claim to truth or to science, or in this case, because Shapiro, of course, is Jewish, that Judeo Christian values have some sort of unique place. But okay, enough of me talking. Let's actually watch some of the debate together.
That there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they've placed them. And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems for example,
So Shapiro's argument, just to go back, is that there are certain things that we can point to that lie outside of the material. This is his own words: materialist, Darwinistic account of reality or of the world. One of those was free will, which they discussed in the first section. The other, rationality. The third, ethics. And so now they're going to get into like a little back and forth about ethics and the role and the relationship between ethics in religion, ethics in society.
A lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say is a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned.
So this is exactly why I want to call people like Shapiro out on their discourse and rhetoric, because the dog whistle that you oftentimes hear with people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, even people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, which is interesting because Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are atheists, right? So they're supposed to be at conflict with each other. But the dog whistle that you hear is this dog whistle about Western values, or in the case of Shapiro and Peterson, it's Judeo-Christian values are somehow unique. And I'm calling this out as problematic because the contributions of Islamic civilization specifically are excluded from that dialogue. Now, when Shapiro, for example, talked about the origin and development of the scientific revolution, if he were to also be talking about the contributions of Islamic scientists, I probably wouldn't have made all of these videos about it. But because Islam specifically is excluded from these conversations, that's what's raising these major red flags to me. And that's why I'm calling attention to this meta narrative that's being presented in the first place. But let's get back to it.
The sort of culture of Europe and its success, and America, is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually
he's good too.
Actually, the great. I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like. A society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. As I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive.
Good. Okay. So this goes back to that narrative I was talking about at the beginning, the conflict thesis versus the complementary. I don't know what it doesn't have a name for it. I'm just calling it the complementary thesis. And I'm not necessarily suggesting, I hope I'm not suggesting, I hope that you didn't interpret what I said as suggesting that O'Connor somehow supports the conflict thesis. I don't necessarily think he does, but he's drawing kind of inspiration from some of the popular stories that are often mentioned in the conflict thesis. And so I want to highlight it here. So what Shapiro will come back with, and what Shapiro has said and other people like Shapiro. I'm thinking of specifically Jordan Peterson has recently made this claim, and other people like O'Connor mentions, Tom Holland, although Holland is doing it in a more academic and informed sense, is making this claim that developments like the scientific revolution arose out of a uniquely Christian context. Now, I've made several videos about this that are on my channel. I'll link a few of those in the description of this video if you're interested. But I would just want to take a few seconds, and I'll make a full-length video on Galileo as well, because this is a popular example that's often utilized, is the fact that putting these historical examples within some sort of meta-narrative like the conflict thesis, using Galileo, the example of Galileo, to say that religion and science are in conflict, for example, or conversely, using Galileo to say that religion and science are complementary, that because of the uniquely Christian assumptions of the early scientists of the early scientific revolution, that we get the development of science in the first place. And what I want to say here is that it's a both and rather than an either or. And O'Connor is alluding to this a little bit. I just think he overstates the case. And Shapiro will definitely overstate the case, again, on the opposite end of the spectrum. So with Galileo specifically, and I should probably make a full-length video on this, but you kind of have the lineage of the early astronomers, starting with Nicholas Copernicus, then going to Galileo, Kepler, and then kind of culminating. I just realized I was off the screen there. Culminating with Newton, but there is this sort of pushback by the church, specifically during the lifetime of Galileo, about the teaching of Copernicanism. Copernicus's book on the revolution of the heavenly spheres is there's a edict. What's the official name? A proclamation by the church that goes out in 1616, condemning the book as heresy, forbidding it for it to be used. Galileo, of course, in 1616 is warned by the church about his teaching of the Copernican doctrine. Galileo goes on to publish a book of his own that is in support of Copernicanism, on the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. That's right. I gotta look over at my notes there. Dialogues concerning two chief world systems, about 15 years later. And it's because of that book that he will stand trial. Now, this trial has been over exaggerated for a lot of different reasons. Again, going back to that whole meta narrative thing. Let me just say here, so it's in a couple of different sources that I should go ahead and point out. Let me just pull those up real quick. So I was going to go into a little bit of depth here, but I'll probably save that for a different video. The first book source that I would recommend, this is more of an academic text. It's a little dense, to be clear, but it's called In the Wake of Galileo by Michael Sergey. I'm not sure, Michael, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name. I have a weird last name too. If you would like to come talk about your book, please, if with the off chance that you would actually see this fantastic book. But Sergey does a great job of pointing out the nuances of the Galileo story. It's not just about the teaching of Copernicanism. In other words, it's not just the doctrine itself that the church had a problem with. Now, to be clear, the church did have a problem with Copernicanism for the position that it took with respect to the location of the earth around the sun. In fact, you could see that specifically in the edict. Copernicus's book is categorized as heresy precisely for that reason. But also at stake here is what they will identify as a sort of Pythagoreanism. I mentioned this in a few of my other videos, but really a big debate that's happening is not so much the physical meaning of the theories, but the use of mathematics that people like Copernicus and Galileo, they're really arguing about the status of mathematics. Is one of my interpretations of it, just to add a little bit of nuance there. But Sergei also points out that there's a lot of political things happening behind the scenes, specifically the status of the Medici family within Italy, and who the Medici family supported and who they didn't support played as an important role in the story of Galileo as that of Galileo versus the church. But of course, it's presented as Galileo versus the church, because that's a more, I can't say romantic, I don't want to say sexy. It's a more interesting story, right? People want to read about that. I guess the Assassin's Creed games made the Medici's family pretty famous again, but it's a pretty convoluted political issue concerning patronage, concerning the church, concerning who got to teach at what university. And it's a very complicated story. Another book that I would highly recommend, it's edited by one of my favorite historians of science, Ronald Numbers. It's called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. It's a collection of essays. Highly recommend it. It's got a fantastic essay actually about Galileo and about the torture that supposedly that did not take place. Was Galileo threatened with torture? Yes, and O'Connor gets that bit right, but it was a lot less. We've kind of dramatized the whole ordeal. The trial didn't really last that long. He was put on house arrest. Yes, it was an unfortunate situation. Yes, but there was no physical torture that took place. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. So let's go back to the video. Shapiro is going to kind of rebut some of the things that O'Connor's saying here.
To the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing it. So to take the abolitionist movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution.
Yeah, so I know I've said this a few other times in some of the other videos, but people really love to bring up Isaac Newton here. Shapiro said that he was deeply ensconced. I'm not even sure what that means. Deeply entrenched within the New Testament. I don't know why he specified the New Testament, because Newton, of course, was kind of obsessed with the Hebrew Bible as well, that Shapiro ought to be aware of. But the identification of Newton as religious, I liked how Shapiro used religious there and not explicitly Christian, because Newton has a lot of theological controversy that surrounds him. I went into this in depth in one of my other videos. But Newton, of course, was not a traditional Christian, or not a Christian in the way that a lot of Christians would define what it means to be Christian. What I'm specifically talking about here is that he was not a Trinitarian. He did not believe in the Trinity. He thought that the Son, so in the Christian Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, he thought that Jesus was a lesser deity from God, and that the Holy Spirit was a separate deity as well. Newton also kind of a pantheist, or panentheist, I guess I should say. Newton believed that the physical properties of time and space, and under the Newtonian system, time and space are absolute throughout all of the universe, the same everywhere and always. Newton believed that absolute time and space were the physical body, body, loosely speaking, of God. Now, I say Newton, this actually comes from the Samuel Clarke and Leibniz correspondence, in which they're kind of going back and forth. And it's Clarke who says this, but it's believed by a lot of scholars that Clarke was simply representing Newton's view here. And if we accept that as Newton's view, Newton believed that the physical universe that we inhabit and that we live in was the sensorium, the physical presence of God. So at least not an orthodox Christian position. Was he religious? Yes. Was he orthodox in his Christianity? No. And I point that out because these people, just like anybody today, can't really be compartmentalized, put under like a general umbrella. History and the people that inhabited history, that's a weird way of saying it, the people who were once alive, are just as complicated as people today, in that they had all sorts of different positions. And that's the big point I want to raise here, is that we have to be very careful, and red flags ought to be going off for you anytime somebody tries to reduce a historical narrative, a historical story, to a simplistic one-word explanation like Judeo-Christian values, or like conflict between science and religion. That should raise red flags, because again, history is way, way too complicated for those sorts of explanations. And that's the big thing that I wanted to point out with this video. I think I'm going to make another video on this whole Judeo-Christian values thing here shortly. But anyway, once again, let me know what you thought of the debate, or what you thought of my ideas that I presented here. I hope that you all enjoyed this video. And until next time, I will see you all later.